She mocked the human warrior, so he removed his armor and walked away in silence. The challenge ring at Keith Hold was cut into the mountain itself, a perfect circle of black stone worn smooth by 400 years of boots and blood, and Derek Mallon had been standing at its edge for the better part of an hour without anyone asking why a human was there at all. That suited him. He'd learned, in the 3 years since the Concord opened its first contracted training posts on Velgeth worlds, that the fastest way to survive among a warrior culture was to be unremarkable until the moment you weren't. He kept his arms crossed, his stance loose, his expression the careful blank of a man watching a sport he didn't fully understand and wasn't trying to. Around him, the benches carved into the ring's upper lip were filling with Keith kin, broad-shouldered, gray-skinned, eyes the burnt orange of banked coals, every one of them dressed in the layered leather and bone plate that marked clan status. They were loud in the way of people who had never had reason to lower their voices, and they did not look at him twice, which was exactly how he liked it. Keith Hold sat at the lip of a mountain range that ran the spine of the planet's northern continent, its outer walls built from the same black volcanic stone as the ring below, and the whole structure had the look of something that had grown out of the rock, rather than been built on top of it, squat, ancient, utterly unconcerned with impressing anyone who didn't already understand what they were looking at. Derek had been on this world a year and a half, long enough to know that the Hold's particular flavor of honor culture ran deeper than most Concord briefing packets bothered to capture. A society built around the challenge ring the way some human cultures had once built themselves around courts of law, every dispute of consequence eventually finding its way down to that circle of black stone to be settled in front of witnesses. It was, by most measures he'd encountered across a decade of Concord postings, one of the more functional systems he'd seen, transparent, consistent, mercifully free of the backroom maneuvering that plagued most diplomatic disputes. It was also, he'd learned the hard way more than once, entirely unforgiving of anyone who mistook its formality for gentleness. He'd come for Tomas Reyes. Reyes was a Concord liaison technician 3 years into a 5-year post, a soft-spoken man with a wife back on Earth and a habit of getting himself into situations his paperwork didn't cover, and 4 days ago he'd made the mistake of correcting a Keith Elder's translation of a trade clause in front of witnesses. It hadn't been arrogance. Reyes had genuinely believed he was helping. But Keith Honor Law didn't parse intent, only outcome, and the outcome was that Reyes had been publicly shamed for daring to be right in the wrong room, which under clan custom meant someone now had standing to challenge him for the insult. And the only person with both the legal status and the stupidity to accept that challenge on Reyes's behalf was the man currently dressed in borrowed Keith half-plate at the center of the ring, waiting for his opponent. Derek had spent 2 days trying to talk Reyes into letting the matter resolve itself through the slower, quieter channel of formal apology, the kind the Concord liaison office usually arranged for exactly this sort of cultural misstep. The Keith elders had refused it. Honor law, once invoked publicly, couldn't be walked back through a private letter. That wasn't a loophole the system left open, and the elder Reyes had embarrassed had made very clear, through 3 increasingly tense meetings, that the only acceptable resolution now ran through the ring. Reyes had wanted to stand for himself. Derek had talked him out of that too, not because he doubted the man's courage, but because Reyes had never held a blade in his life, and the Hold's challenge law made allowance for a substitute precisely, so that situations like this didn't end with an untrained civilian bleeding out over a translation error. The substitution had to be a person with standing of their own, military service, a recognized post, some claim to being taken seriously as more than an apology with legs. Derek, 4 years out from a uniform he didn't wear anymore, fit the requirement well enough on paper. He hadn't loved how easily he'd qualified. He'd come anyway. He always came anyway in situations like this. It was less a decision at this point than a kind of muscle memory, the same instinct that had kept him standing in front of frightened contractors and overmatched liaison officers for 3 years now, the residue of a career he'd otherwise tried hard to leave behind him. Derek wasn't conquered military anymore. He'd left that life 4 years back, after Velgath Station, after the thing that had happened there that he didn't talk about, and that had left him with a scar along his ribs and a much smaller appetite for proving himself with a weapon in his hand. Velgath had been a peacekeeping post, ostensibly a tense border garrison between two conquered-aligned worlds that hadn't quite finished hating each other yet. And Derek had been good there, good in the way the service wanted him to be. Fast, certain, unbothered by the part of the job that involved hurting people who'd been told to hurt him first. He'd taken an opening once, in a sanctioned duel of honor not unlike the kind Keith Custom still practiced, a settlement between two officers from rival garrisons the brass had blessed, because it was supposed to be cleaner than letting two units posture at each other with live weapons. He'd been better than the other man. He'd known it within the first 30 seconds, the same flat certainty he'd feel again years later watching Sira vast Keith's tells in a different ring entirely. And he'd taken the kill shot anyway, because that was what the duel called for, because stopping short would have been read as an insult worse than finishing it, because the room had wanted a winner and he'd given them one. The man's name had been Halvorson. He still knew it, still woke with it some nights, 4 years and one whole career later. He hadn't known, until she came looking for him at the garrison gate 3 weeks after, that Halvorson had a sister, younger, fierce, entirely unprepared for grief, who'd crossed 2 systems on a civilian transit pass just to stand in front of the man who'd killed her brother in a fight neither of them had actually needed to finish. She hadn't screamed at him. That was the part he remembered most, the part that still surfaced at 3 in the morning more than anything else from that whole posting. She just looked at him, quiet, devastated, and asked him if it had felt good, if winning had been worth it. He'd resigned his commission within the month. He told people when they asked that he'd simply burned out on garrison work, which was true as far as it went and left out everything that actually mattered. What he'd actually walked away with was a private vow he'd never said aloud to another living person. Win if you have to. Never win for the room. Never again let an audience decide what a fight was worth more than the person standing across from him did. These days he ran security consultation for 3 trade posts along the Kesar arm, which mostly meant he told nervous conquered contractors not to do exactly the kind of thing Reyes had just done. Don't correct an elder in front of witnesses. Don't assume good intent translates across honor cultures that didn't share the concept. Don't mistake a quiet room for a safe one. He'd taken the substitution duel because Reyes had a wife and a kid on the way, and because nobody else had stepped up, and because some habits, the habit of standing in front of people who couldn't stand for themselves, didn't leave just because you wanted them to. He had not expected his opponent to be the chieftain's daughter. She came down through the gate on the ring's far side without ceremony, which he understood later was itself a kind of statement. A challenger of true status didn't need a herald. She moved like someone who had never once doubted a room would arrange itself around her, and the crowd's noise sharpened into something with an edge to it, 100 voices recognizing her at once. She wore dueling leathers the deep red-black of dried blood, sleeveless, her arms corded with the kind of muscle that came from actual use rather than display, and her skin was a cool gray-violet that darkened at the knuckles and along her jaw into something almost black, like stone that had been near a fire. Her hair was cropped close on one side and left long and silver-white on the other, braided through with what he'd learned later were combat tokens, small bone discs, one for every duel she'd won and never lost. Her eyes were the same banked orange as every Keith he'd seen, but hers had a brightness to them, a sharpness, that made the rest of the hold's warriors look half asleep by comparison. Sira Vas Keith, murmured the elder beside him, an interpreter the conquered post had loaned him for the day, a nervous younger man named Oren who clearly wished he were anywhere else. eldest daughter of Chief Keith Vask, hold champion 4 years running. She holds the right of challenge whenever clan honors invoked and no kin steps forward first. Oren swallowed. I did not expect her to take this one personally. Why would she? Because Ray's correction touched a trade clause she negotiated herself. Oren's voice dropped further. She is not used to being shown wrong. And she does not think much of conquered softskins generally, fewer still of human ones who carry steel and call it a fair fight. He glanced toward the gate. Sira had not yet come through, his nerves plain on his face. If I were you, I would not expect mercy because you are a substitute and not the man who gave the original offense. Sira Vask Keith does not distinguish between the insult and whoever stands closest to it when the bill comes due. Derek looked across the ring at her and understood. In the particular flat way, he understood most threats, that this was not going to be the kind of fight where anyone explained the rules to him kindly. She didn't wait for the ringmaster's signal before she spoke. She crossed half the distance between them first, slow, deliberate, sizing him the way a butcher sizes a carcass. And when she stopped, she did it close enough that he could see the old scar threading pale gray through one eyebrow. This is what they send. Her conquered trade was accented but clean, pitched to carry to the benches, and the benches laughed on cue. A soft skin and borrowed plate standing in for a man too cowardly to answer for his own insult. Her gaze went over him once, head to boots, frank and dismissive in a way that had nothing performative left in it at all. Tell me, human, does your kind even bleed? Or do they simply apologize and fall over? More laughter. Derek let it roll past him without changing his face. He'd been baited by better than this, by men with knives and worse intentions, and he'd learned a long time ago that the calm cost nothing and bought everything. She wasn't finished. She circled him once, unhurried, the way a predator circles something it hasn't decided is worth the effort of killing yet, and the benches followed her with their attention, hungry for whatever came next. I have fought your kind before, she said, louder now, performing for the crowd as much as speaking to him. 2 seasons passed. A conquered garrison officer thought he could earn trade concessions by proving himself in this ring. He lasted less time than it took the elders to seat themselves. A ripple of laughter, recognition, someone in the upper benches calling out a half-remembered detail of that earlier humiliation. I wonder which will be faster, you or him. I don't know him, Derek said, and I'm not him. No, she agreed, and something sharpened in her voice. You're worse. He at least believed he had a chance. She stopped circling, planted herself a stride away, close enough now that the rest of the ring fell away, and it was just the 2 of them and 200 watching faces. You stand there already resigned to losing. I can see it in how you hold that blade like a man borrowing a tool he doesn't trust himself to use. Tell your liaison friend he should have found someone with actual pride to defend him, instead of sending an apology with a sword strapped to it. I'm not here to answer for an insult, he said, quiet enough that she had to lean fractionally in to catch it, which annoyed her. He watched it land, the small flicker of irritation that she hadn't meant to need to listen. I'm here because a man with a family made a mistake in a room that doesn't forgive mistakes, and nobody else was going to stand in front of that for him. Sentiment, she said the word like it tasted bad. You volunteered for nothing then. Ray's shame is Ray's to carry. You'll only carry his loss along with it. Maybe. There's no maybe in this ring, human. There's the fight and then there's the floor. She turned, finally, walking back toward her mark, already done with him in her own mind. Over her shoulder, loud enough for every bench to hear, try not to make it too brief. The crowd paid in good faith for a contest, not an execution. The benches roared. Derek stood very still in the center of all that noise and felt something old and tired move in his chest, not fear. He'd burned through his capacity for fear a long time back, but a kind of weariness at how familiar this particular shape of cruelty was. He'd met it in officers who mistook rank for worth. He'd met it in men twice his size who thought a scar made an argument. He recognized it now in a chieftain's daughter, who had never once had to find out what she was without an audience agreeing with her first. The ringmaster called the duel. She came in fast, faster than her build suggested she should, all that corded strength compressed into a first strike meant to end things before they started, the curved Keith dueling blade flashing toward his unguarded side. He'd half expected it. He turned the strike with the flat of his own borrowed sword more out of old reflex than any plan, felt the impact run up through his wrist, and gave ground without losing his feet, which was, he understood from the way her eyes narrowed, not the response she'd been counting on. She'd expected him down already. They traded for almost a minute, real exchanges, nothing decorative, her speed against his economy. She came at him in combinations, fast, two-handed work that used the curve of the dueling blade to draw rather than chop, looking for the angle that would slip past a guard rather than break it, and he found himself reading her the way he'd once read soldiers across a training yard. The slight drop of her left shoulder before she committed to a feint, the way she exhaled on the real strike, and held her breath on the false one, small honest things her body did that her face had long since learned to hide. She was good, better than good, the kind of fighter the Hold's 4-year unbeaten record actually deserved, not a champion propped up by reputation alone. He gave ground in careful increments, conserving, parrying more than striking, and the crowd's noise sharpened into something with real attention in it now, a different register than the mockery they'd started with. He held her, which surprised the benches into a different kind of quiet. He wasn't trying to win. He decided that somewhere in the first 10 seconds, watching the way she moved, reading the years of real combat under the showmanship. This woman could kill him if she committed fully, and the only reason she hadn't yet was that some part of her still wanted the satisfaction of doing it slowly, in front of people, the way she'd promised the crowd. She was testing him, pushing the pace just shy of lethal, watching to see when he'd break, when he'd panic into a mistake an audience could laugh at before she finally closed it out. And the longer he refused to give her that mistake, the more her strikes sharpened from contempt into something closer to genuine effort, as though some buried part of her resented being denied even the satisfaction of an easy kill. He could have ended it differently. He'd trained men who'd have found the opening she kept leaving, a half-second drop in her guard on the backswing, a tell he was certain she didn't know she had. He could have taken it. He'd taken worse openings against worse opponents and walked away the only one standing. He thought about Velgeth Station instead. About a different ring, a different kind of audience, and a moment 4 years back where he'd taken an opening just like this one, and the man on the other end of it had a sister who came looking for him afterward, and Derek had spent 2 years since trying to forget the sound she'd made finding out. He'd promised himself something after that. Not a vow exactly. More like a debt he was still paying down, one decision at a time, every time the choice came up again. Win if you have to. Never win for the room. So when the opening came again, third time, clean as a door left open, he didn't take it. He stepped back instead, lowered his blade. And in the sudden uncertain hush that followed, with 200 Keith warriors trying to work out what they were watching, he reached up and began unbuckling the borrowed half-plate at his shoulder. "What is this?" Sira's voice cracked across the ring, sharp with something that wasn't quite anger yet, closer to confusion, the particular disorientation of a person watching a script come apart in real time. "Pick up your guard, human." He didn't answer. He worked the buckle free, set the shoulder plate down on the black stone with a care that felt almost ceremonial, and started on the next. "I said pick up your guard," louder now, and the crowd's murmur had turned into something closer to a held breath. "Is this surrender? Kneel and say so then, and I'll grant you the mercy of a quick end instead of a coward's exit." "It's not surrender." He set the second plate down beside the first. His voice, when it came, was no louder than it had been across the whole conversation, but it carried anyway into the strange new quiet the ring had fallen into. "Surrender means I still think this is a fight worth finishing. I don't." "You don't, flat dangerous." You didn't bring me here to test a blade. He unbuckled the breastplate, lifted it off, set it down with the others, a small, deliberate pile of borrowed armor accumulating at his feet, while 200 people watched and nobody moved to stop him. You brought me here to be laughed at. That's a different contest, and I'm not interested in playing it. He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd crossed the ring toward him, he let himself actually look at her instead of reading her like a threat to be managed, the fury building behind those banked orange eyes, and underneath the fury, so far down he wasn't sure she knew it was there herself, something that looked almost like the first crack of being genuinely surprised. I came here for a man with a family who needed someone to stand in front of him. I did that. I'm not going to bleed for your audience's entertainment on top of it. He set the last piece, the borrowed vambrace, down on the stone, squared with the others, neat as a man laying out tools at the end of a job. Then he turned his back on her, on the ring, on 200 Keithkin who had never in 400 years of recorded challenge law watched anyone simply walk away from a duel mid-fight without invoking surrender, defeat, or death. And he walked toward the gate, unarmed, unarmored, in the plain undershirt he'd worn beneath the borrowed plate, and he did not look back. The silence behind him was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. Nobody stopped him at the gate. Nobody followed him, not that day. He walked the long switchback path down from the hold's upper ring to the trade post's guest quarters with Oren half jogging to keep pace, the younger man's face caught somewhere between horror and a kind of helpless awe. You understand what you just did, Oren said, finally, once they were far enough down the mountain that the noise from the hold had faded to a distant murmur. You understand that no one walks away from a vast Keith challenge, not in living memory. People talk about Sira's record like it's a law of physics. I'm aware she's good. Derek kept walking. His shoulder ached where her first strike had connected through the plate. He'd have a bruise the size of a fist by morning. I'm also aware that being good with a blade and being owed your dignity by the person standing across from you are two different things. She wanted a show. I gave her something else. You gave her an insult worse than the one you came to answer for. Oren's voice had gone thin with worry. Derek Sira Vaskeith has never been refused anything in this hold. Not a duel, not a request, not a— he stopped himself. Not a what? Nothing. It's not my place. But the younger man's eyes had gone careful in a way that told Derek there was a story there he wasn't going to get today, and he let it go, because it wasn't his business, and because his shoulder hurt, and because Reyes was waiting back at the post with a wife who needed to know her husband wasn't going to lose his standing, or worse, over a translation mistake. He found Reyes pacing outside the guest quarters, already half convinced from the post's anxious comms chatter that something terrible had happened. Derek told him the short version. The duel hadn't gone the way anyone expected, but it was over, and as far as he could tell, Reyes' debt to clan honor was discharged either way. A substitute had stood and fought, and the matter had been formally answered, however strangely. Reyes didn't look reassured. He looked like a man who suspected he was going to spend the rest of his posting hearing this story retold in increasingly dramatic versions by people who hadn't been there, which, as it turned out, was exactly what happened. By the next morning, half the trade post staff had heard some version of it. By the morning after, the version had reached the other two posts along the Kesar arm, growing a little stranger each time it passed through someone new. The human who'd refused to fight the hold champion, the human who'd beaten her and refused to claim the kill, the human who'd simply taken off his armor in the middle of the ring and walked into the mountain and was never seen again. Derek ignored all of it as best he could. He had worked a perimeter audit at the second post, a contractor's complaint about smuggling through the lower docks that turned out to be real and took most of a week to untangle properly. And he told himself the whole strange afternoon at Keith Hold was a closed matter, the kind of thing that happened once in a posting and then got filed away. He was wrong about that, but it took 11 days for him to find out how wrong. What he didn't know yet, what he'd only pieced together later, from Oren's careful half-explanations and the things Sira herself eventually admitted, reluctantly, in the months that followed, was what those 11 days had actually been like inside the hold, behind the high stone walls he never saw. Sira Vaskeith had stood in the center of that ring for a long time after he walked out the gate, the curved dueling blade still loose in her hand, while 200 Keithkin sat in a silence that had no precedent in 400 years of recorded challenge law to draw on. She had been champion for 4 years. She had ended duels with broken bones, with blood on the black stone, with grown warriors weeping in defeat in front of their own clans, and she had never once, not a single time, watched an opponent simply decide the fight wasn't worth finishing and remove themselves from it without permission. There was no ritual response for it. The elders who governed challenge law had to convene that same night, combing through records 4 centuries deep, before anyone could even tell her formally what had happened to her, that she had triggered, by her own conduct in calling the duel, an obscure honor mechanism called the walked match, invoked only when a challenger's contempt for the terms of a fight outweighed their fear of losing it. The hold was obligated, by that same ancient mechanism, to ask the walker why. No one had invoked it in living memory. No one currently breathing had ever had to ask the question, let alone receive an answer. She had not slept well in the days after. She told him, much later, that she had gone back to the ring alone on the 3rd night, long after the benches had emptied, and stood where he'd stood, and tried to understand what a person had to be made of to walk away from a fight they could have won simply, because winning it the way it was offered wasn't worth having. She had turned the question over from every angle she knew how to hold a thing as a tactical failure on his part, as a deliberate insult calculated to humiliate her in front of her own people, as cowardice dressed up as principle, and none of those readings had survived contact with what she'd actually watched happen in that ring. He hadn't looked afraid. He hadn't looked smug, the way a man might look if the walk-away had been theater of his own. He had looked, she eventually admitted, like someone setting down a weight he'd decided wasn't his to carry, with no particular interest in whether anyone watching approved. By the 8th day she had stopped pretending to her father that the matter was closed. By the 10th, she had stopped pretending to herself. By the 11th, she had made the walk down the mountain alone, which was, Oren told him afterward with something close to reverence, a thing the hold champion had not done in 9 years of holding the title, not once, for any reason, without an honor guard at her back to remind the world what she was. She had gone without one anyway. He didn't know that day what it had cost her to make that particular walk. He only knew, watching her stand uncertain in his office doorway, that whatever it had cost her, she'd paid it without being asked. She came to the trade post alone, which Oren told him later was itself nearly as unprecedented as the walk-away had been. The hold champion didn't travel without an honor guard, not for any reason short of a formal diplomatic visit, and certainly not down to a conquered post to speak to a single human security contractor in person. He was in the back office reviewing the smuggling case's final paperwork when she appeared in the doorway, and he had a half-second of genuine disorientation before he placed her, out of the dueling leathers, dressed instead in plain dark travel clothes, hair unbraided from its combat tokens and simply pulled back, no audience behind her for the first time since he'd seen her. She looked younger like this. Less like a legend and more like a woman somewhere in her late 20s, who'd walked a long way to be standing in this doorway, and hadn't entirely decided, even now, that it was the right decision. "You left before I could answer you," she said, without preamble, without the trade-pitched volume she'd used in the ring. Her conquered trade was still accented, still clean but quieter now, almost careful. "I have spent 11 days deciding whether I was owed an answer at all. I am still not certain, but I came anyway." He set down the datapad he'd been holding. "Answer to what?" "To what you said." Her jaw tightened, the old scar through her eyebrow shifting with it. That I brought you to the ring to be laughed at. That I wasn't interested in a fight, only an audience. A pause, longer than it needed to be. You were correct. I have turned that fact over more times than I would like to admit, and I cannot find a way to make it untrue, however much I would prefer to. Derek studied her for a moment, the careful stillness of someone who had clearly rehearsed this, and was finding the rehearsal harder to deliver than expected. Why does it matter to you whether I was correct? Because no one has ever told me I was wrong and meant it as anything other than an insult to be punished. The words came out faster than the rest, like something that had been pressing against her teeth since the ring. My whole life, Derek Mallon, people have agreed with me. My father's chieftain. My mother died when I was young enough that I don't fully remember her voice, only that she let me win arguments I shouldn't have. By the time I held the championship myself, no one in the hold has corrected me about anything in 9 years. Not my strategy, not my temper, not the way I speak to outsiders, nothing. You did it in front of 200 witnesses and then you simply left. You didn't even stay to watch me understand it. I wasn't there to watch you understand anything. His voice stayed even, but something in his chest had gone careful, the particular attentiveness he kept for moments when a conversation was about to matter more than it looked like it should. I was there to keep a man's family from losing him to a custom he didn't know he was breaking. What you did with the rest of it was always yours to do, not mine to witness. That is the part I cannot stop turning over. She crossed the small office and sat, uninvited, in the chair across from his desk, the gesture oddly informal for someone who'd entered a room like a verdict only a minute before. You didn't walk away to humiliate me. I have replayed it 100 times looking for the cruelty in it, and I cannot find any. You simply refused the terms, as though my approval was never the point of you being there at all. Her orange eyes found his, steady now, the fury from the ring entirely gone and something rower in its place. I do not know what to do with a person who doesn't need anything from me. I have built my whole life around being needed or feared or obeyed. I have never once had to be worth something to a person who could simply walk away and lose nothing. The office was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the trade post went on cargo loaders, someone laughing 2 rooms over, the low hum of the climate system. And inside it, Derek found himself looking at a woman who 4 years of distance and a war he didn't talk about had taught him to read very, very carefully, and seeing none of the performance she'd worn into the ring. Just a person, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, sitting across a cheap Concord issue desk, and saying something true out loud for what might have been the first time in longer than she could count. For what it's worth, he said finally, I didn't walk away because your approval didn't matter. I walked away because I wasn't going to earn it by bleeding for an audience that already decided what they wanted to see before the fight started. That's a different thing than not caring. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, not yet, but the ghost of the shape one might eventually take. Then tell me what would earn it, honestly, not the ring's terms. He thought about that question longer than was probably comfortable for either of them. I don't think you earn someone's respect by performing for them, he said at last. I think you earn it by being the same person whether anyone's watching or not. You weren't in that ring. The woman who walked in here alone 11 days later, asking a question she clearly didn't want to ask. That's somebody I'd take a lot more seriously than the hold champion playing to 200 benches. She looked at him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't fully name. Then, quietly, no one has ever separated those 2 people from me before. Even I had stopped trying. She didn't leave that day in any dramatic sense. There was no grand declaration, no formal bond proposed across the desk, nothing the watching trade post staff could have turned into the kind of story that had already spread itself across 3 posts in increasingly absurd versions. She simply stayed an hour longer than either of them seemed to expect, asking him careful, genuine questions about why he'd left Concord military service, listening to answers he hadn't given anyone in full for 4 years. And when she finally rose to leave, she did it with the particular reluctance of someone who'd found, unexpectedly, that they didn't want a conversation to end. She came back 6 days later, not as a challenge, not with an audience, not in dueling leathers in the same plain travel clothes, carrying a bottle of something dark and clearly potent that she set on his desk like an offering she wasn't entirely sure of the etiquette for. "It is traditional," she said, a little stiffly, "to bring something when you visit a person you intend to keep visiting. I am told humans have an equivalent custom. I did not know which gift would translate, so I chose the one that required no translation." He found himself smiling, actually smiling, an unguarded thing he hadn't expected from himself in that office. "That'll do fine." She didn't leave quickly that day either. She sat across from him while he worked through the last of the smuggling paperwork, asking blunt, curious questions about conquered trade law that had nothing to do with dueling and everything to do with a mind that had clearly spent years being trained for combat and very little time being asked what it actually found interesting. He found himself explaining customs tariffs to the hold champion of Keith with more patience than he generally had for anyone, and somewhere in the middle of it she laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound, like she hadn't expected to be capable of it in that particular room. At a dry aside, he hadn't meant as a joke until she made it one. It became a pattern after that, loose and unscheduled at first. She would appear at the post 2 or 3 times in a 10-day, always with some thin pretext. A question about trade routes, a complaint about conquered cargo manifests that didn't actually need her personal attention to resolve. And he stopped pretending, after the 3rd visit, that he didn't rearrange his own schedule around the chance she might come. They walked the lower ridge trail together more than once, she pointing out plant life that had killed careless outsiders, and he asking enough genuine questions that she stopped sounding like she was reciting a warning and started sounding like she was sharing something she loved. He told her in pieces about Earth, not the parts of his service record that still kept him up some nights, not yet, but the ordinary things. The smell of rain on a particular kind of pavement, a sister back home he hadn't called in longer than he should have, the strange disorientation of being a man who'd left one war behind only to spend 3 years quietly managing the threat of smaller ones along a conquered trade arm. She listened in a way he hadn't been listened to in a long time, not waiting for her turn to speak, not measuring his words for weakness the way the ring had taught her to measure everyone, just listening, the way a person listens when they've genuinely decided someone is worth understanding. It was slow. It was supposed to be slow. He came to think neither of them built for anything else, both of them carrying enough wreckage from the lives that had shaped them that rushing toward each other would only have repeated old mistakes in new shapes. But it was steady, too, in a way that surprised him more than the speed of it ever could have. She started bringing him small things from the hold's markets, not gifts exactly, more like evidence she'd thought of him while she was somewhere he wasn't. A strip of dried meat from a vendor she swore made the best in the ring's lower quarter. A hand-carved whistle some hold child had made and pressed on her that she decided, for reasons she didn't fully explain, belonged with him instead. He started keeping a second cup in the back office that he told himself wasn't specifically for her, and was, every time, exactly for her. Over the following weeks, what had started as an apology she hadn't fully known how to give became something else entirely, not quickly, and not without friction, because Sira Vaskeith did not know how to want something without also being suspicious of wanting it, and Derek Mallon had spent 4 years building a careful, deliberate distance between himself and anything that might ask him to risk being needed again. They circled each other for a while, 2 people equally unpracticed at the particular vulnerability of letting someone matter. She would arrive at the post unannounced and pretend the visit was about trade logistics. He would find reasons to walk the upper switchback path toward the hold under the cover of routine security checks that didn't, strictly, require him to go anywhere near the hold at all. She has refused every formal match request since she took the championship, Oren told him one evening, careful, the way a man tells another man something he's not entirely sure he's allowed to. 4 years of suitors lining up to court the hold's daughter, and she has turned away every single one without a real reason given. I think, and I am only guessing, that she has been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone who didn't want the champion. Only her. Derek didn't say anything to that for a long moment. He went back to work and didn't bring it up with Sira and let the words sit. The hold itself was not so quiet about it. Word of the champion's visits to the human trade post had reached the upper ring within a week, and the clan elders, the same body that had been forced to dig through 4 centuries of record to explain the walked match to a confused crowd, were no more comfortable with this development than they'd been with the first one. Derek learned secondhand, through Oren's increasingly nervous reports, that there had been a closed council session devoted almost entirely to the question of what, precisely, the hold's champion thought she was doing spending her evenings with the same human who'd publicly refused to fight her. He learned, a week after that Sira's own father had finally said something about it directly, not a council matter, but a private one, father to daughter, which by Oren's account had gone considerably worse for the chieftain than he'd expected. She told Derek about it herself, weeks later, sitting across from him in the back office with the particular flat calm she used when something still cost her to discuss. Her father had called her into his private hall and asked her, not unkindly but not gently either, whether she understood what she was risking. The hold's confidence in her judgment, the clan's patience with a champion who'd already broken 400 years of precedent once that season, the standing she'd need intact if she ever meant to lead the hold herself one day, as her bloodline entitled her to. He had not forbidden it outright. Keith Custom didn't give him that authority over an adult daughter, not even a chieftain over a champion. But he had made his disapproval plain and asked her more than once to consider whether a human consultant from a conquered trade post was worth what she stood to lose. I told him, she said, that I had spent 4 years being the person this hold needed me to be in every room I ever stood in, and that I had never once, in all that time, been asked whether it was the person I wanted to be. Her jaw had the same set to it he remembered from the ring, though nothing else about her in that moment resembled the woman who'd mocked him there. He did not have an answer to that. I do not think anyone has ever asked him the same question in all his years leading this hold. I think, perhaps, that is the real reason this frightens him, not that I have chosen a human, but that I have chosen anything at all, for the first time, without first asking whether the hold approved. What did he say? Nothing for a long while. Then he told me I had better be certain. A small, unguarded smile, the first one Derek had seen reach all the way to her eyes. I told him I was working on it. That seemed to satisfy him more than a confident answer would have. He has never trusted certainty that arrives too easily. It took her father most of a season to come around fully, and he never did it with any grand declaration. Only a gradual softening Derek watched from a careful distance, an invitation to a hold gathering he hadn't expected, a brief, gruff conversation about trade post security logistics that managed, somewhere in the middle of it, to become something closer to an actual conversation between 2 men sizing each other up and finding, despite themselves, less to dislike than either had braced for. The clan's younger warriors took longer to come around, and one of them, a broad-shouldered second-rank fighter named Kresh who'd made no secret of his own interest in the champion before Derek had ever set foot in the ring, decided, 2 months into the season, to test the matter directly. He found Derek on the lower switchback path one evening alone, and made it plain in blunt, deliberately public conquered trade that he didn't believe the walkaway had been principle at all, only a clever soft-skins way of avoiding a beating he knew he couldn't survive. He offered Derek a second match. No audience this time, no honor law invoked, Just the two of them and whatever truth came out of it. An offer phrased less as an invitation than a dare he expected to go unanswered. Derek had turned him down, flatly, without heat, in the same even voice he'd used in the ring months before. "I didn't walk away from Sira because I was afraid of losing," he'd said. "I walked away because I wasn't going to bleed to satisfy an audience. You're not offering me anything different, you're just smaller about it." Kresh hadn't taken that well. He'd pushed harder, called Derek a coward to his face, loud enough that two other warriors training nearby had stopped to watch. And for a moment Derek had felt the old, familiar pull of it, the part of him that had once been very good at proving people wrong with a blade in his hand, the part that 4 years hadn't fully worn away no matter how much he wanted it gone. He'd felt it, and he'd set it down anyway, the same deliberate motion as unbuckling armor on black stone. "You can call me whatever you want," he'd said. "It won't make this a fight worth having." And he'd walked on up the path, leaving Kresh standing there with nothing to push against. Sira heard about it within the day. The Hold's gossip network moved faster than any official channel, and she came to find him that evening with an expression he couldn't immediately read, somewhere between fury and something gentler underneath it. "He had no right to challenge you off the ring, outside any honor law," she said, sitting beside him on the low post wall, her hands not quite steady around the bottle of dark liquor she'd brought, which he'd come to understand by then was less a gift than a thing she held when she didn't know what else to do with her hands. "I should have warned you he might try something like it. He has wanted the title beside my name since before I held the championship myself. I handled it fine." "I know you did. That is rather the point I am struggling with." She looked at him, and the fury had mostly burned away by then, leaving something more exposed underneath. "You refused him exactly the way you refused me, not from fear. She stopped, searching for the word in a second language that didn't always hand her the one she wanted. "From knowing your own worth too well to spend it on someone else's terms. I do not think I understood, until I heard what you told him, that what happened in that ring was not a single strange decision. It is simply who you are." "It's not complicated," he said. "I just don't fight to prove anything to people who have already decided what they want to see." "No," she agreed quietly. "I am only beginning to understand how rare that actually is." In the middle of all of it, what had started as an apology she hadn't fully known how to give became something else entirely, not quickly, and not without friction, because Sira Vaskeith did not know how to want something without also being suspicious of wanting it, and Derek Mallon had spent 4 years building a careful, deliberate distance between himself and anything that might ask him to risk being needed again. They circled each other for a while, two people equally unpracticed at the particular vulnerability of letting someone matter. She would arrive at the post unannounced and pretend the visit was about trade logistics. He would find reasons to walk the upper switchback path toward the Hold under the cover of routine security checks that didn't, strictly, require him to go anywhere near the Hold at all. And it was on one of those nights, 3 months into whatever this had become, that she finally told him about Oren's theory regarding the suitors she'd turned away, sitting beside him on the low stone wall outside the Hold's lower gate, the twin moons coming up over the ridgeline and her shoulder pressed against his in the easy, unthinking way that hadn't been there in the beginning. "I have been champion for 4 years, she said, watching the moons rather than him, which he'd come to understand was how she said the things that cost her the most. "Every man who has approached me in that time wanted the title beside my name, the alliance, the standing. I stopped believing somewhere in the 2nd year that anyone could want the person underneath it." She turned, finally, and the moonlight caught the old scar through her eyebrow, the same scar he'd noticed the first day, standing too close to him in the ring with contempt in her voice. "You walked away from a fight I would have let you win, eventually, if you'd only kept performing for it. You have never once, in 3 months, asked me to be the champion for you. I do not know how to thank a person for that. I am not certain there is a word for it in either of our languages." "You don't have to thank me," he said. You just have to keep being the person who walked into my office alone, instead of the one who walked into that ring with an audience. I think, she said slowly, that I would like to try. The hold in the end came around to it, the way the hold came around to most things it didn't expect, slowly, gruffly, and then all at once. The story of the human who'd walked away from a fight he could have won had already become something of a fixture in the lower quarters taverns by the time the engagement was formally announced, retold by people who'd been in the benches that day and people who'd only heard about it second-hand, each version a little more polished than the last, until the strange, quiet act of a man setting down armor on black stone had taken on the shape of something almost mythic. Derek found that uncomfortable in ways he never fully got used to. He hadn't done it to become a story, and being one sat oddly on him. But he noticed, too, that the warriors who'd laughed loudest that first day were, a year later, the ones who nodded to him in the hold's lower corridors with something that wasn't quite respect yet, but was no longer contempt either. Sira told him once that this was probably as much as any outsider could hope for from a 400-year-old warrior culture in the span of a single year, and that he should consider it a victory rather than wait for something warmer that might never come. He decided she was probably right. The formal bonding, when it came nearly a year later, was nothing like the spectacle the hold usually staged for its champions. Sira insisted on that herself, over her father's mild protests and the clan elders' considerably less mild ones. No challenge ring ceremony, no honor guard procession, no audience assembled to witness and approve. Instead they held it at the lower gate, the same low stone wall where she'd told him the truth about 4 years of suitors who'd wanted her title and never her, with the twin moons rising the same way they had that night, and a small handful of people who actually mattered standing witness, instead of 200 strangers come for a show. Reyes was there, with his wife and the daughter who'd been born 6 months into Derek's strange, slow courtship of the hold champion, the same Reyes whose mistranslated trade clause had started all of it, who still, to this day, told the story with a kind of sheepish wonder, as though he still couldn't quite believe his worst week on post had ended up being the reason for someone else's best year. Oren stood near the back, looking pleased with himself in the particular way of a man who'd guessed something true long before anyone else had been willing to say it aloud. Even Kresh had come, standing at the edge of the small gathering with an expression that had nothing left in it of the dare he'd once thrown at Derek on the switchback path. He'd offered, gruffly, a single line of formal goodwill on his way in, the closest thing to an apology Keith custom generally allowed a man like him to make, and Derek had accepted it the same flat, unbothered way he'd refused the challenge that started it. Sira's father gave a short, gruff blessing that everyone present understood to mean considerably more than its brevity suggested, coming from a man who'd never in 9 years had cause to imagine his daughter choosing anyone over the championship she'd built her whole identity around. Sira wore her dueling leathers, not as armor this time, she told him quietly, but because they were the truest thing she owned, the proof of who she was when no one was telling her who to be. She'd taken the combat tokens out of her hair. In their place was a single plain bone disc Derek had carved himself, clumsy and unpolished compared to the hold's craftsmen, marking nothing except the day she'd walked into his office alone. "You once told me," she said, low enough that it stayed between the two of them even with witnesses close enough to hear, "that you earn someone's respect by being the same person whether anyone is watching or not." She took his hand, her grip as steady as it had been across a dueling blade a year and a lifetime ago. "I would like you to know that I have been watching very closely, Derek Mallon, for nearly a year now, and you have never once been a different person for it." "Neither have you," he said, "not since the day you walked in alone." Behind them, the twin moons climbed clear of the ridgeline, and somewhere down in the valley, the ordinary sounds of the trade post went on exactly as they had on every other unremarkable night. Cargo loaders, distant laughter, the low hum of a world that had no idea it had just quietly, permanently changed for two people who'd both spent years believing they didn't need anyone to. Sira Keith, 4-year undefeated hold champion, who had never once in living memory lost a challenge or backed down from one, stood at the low gate and made the only vow of her life that had nothing to do with winning at all. And Derek Mallon, who had walked out of a ring in silence a year before with no plan beyond refusing to perform for an audience that had already decided what it wanted to see, found that the silence had said more than any fight ever could have, and that the woman who'd finally heard it had been worth every quiet year it took to get here. He thought, standing at that gate with her hand steady in his, of Velgath Station, of a sister's quiet question he'd carried for 4 years without ever finding a real answer to. He thought he might finally have one now, not a justification for anything that had happened there, nothing that simple, but a different kind of proof, that the part of him capable of walking away from a fight worth nothing had also, eventually, proven capable of walking towards something worth everything instead. It wasn't an answer Halvorson's sister would ever hear. But it was, he thought, the only kind of answer that had ever really mattered, the kind a man lived out instead of spoke, the kind that didn't need an audience to be true.